The man's voice was a greasy thing, sliding over the hot, dusty air of the town square. "Sturdy," he said, his hand slapping her back with the meaty sound of a butcher striking a side of beef. "Good hips for birthing. Strong back for work. Not a looker, I'll grant you, but you ain't buying a painting to hang on the wall." The crowd tittered. A wave of heat, separate from the sun, washed over Alara's face. She stood on the raised platform of the livery, a place for selling horses and wagons, and felt the familiar, burning shame that had been her constant companion for 24 years. Her father stood beside the broker, Mr. Gable, nodding along, his face a mask of grim necessity. He would not meet her eyes. He had not met her eyes in a week. She was a debt, a heavy, inconvenient weight on his books, and now she was being cleared from the ledger. "She can cook and clean, keep a house," Gable continued, his voice booming. "And she's quiet. Won't give a man no trouble." He was lying. She was quiet, yes, but it was the quiet of a coiled spring, of a storm gathering over the mountains. It was not the quiet of submission. And she could cook, but not the way he meant. She could render fat and salt meat for a long winter. She could calculate rations to the last bean and make a barrel of flour last twice its expected life. Her skills were for survival, not for pleasing. A man in the front row, a merchant with a soft belly and softer hands, called out, "What's the price on this one, Gable? My last housekeeper ran off with the silver." Gable grinned, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "This ain't a housekeeper for hire, friend. This is a contract, a wife. All debts settled for the man who takes her on. Her father's debts, that is." The laughter this time was louder, sharper. It cut into her. It was the sound of her worth being publicly declared as less than zero. She was not a prize. She was a penalty. The cost of doing business with a failed farmer. Alara's hands, clasped in front of her worn brown dress, tightened into fists. The fabric strained at the seams. Her knuckles were white. She stared at a point just over the heads of the crowd, at the shimmering heat rising from the dusty street. She watched a lone hawk circle in the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. It saw everything from distance. It was not judged. It simply was. She had learned long ago to separate her body from her mind. Her body was this large, cumbersome thing that people saw first and judged immediately. It was a prison of flesh she had to drag through the world. But her mind was a fortress. It was ordered and sharp. In her mind, she could calculate the angle of the sun, the flow of water, the subtle shifts in the economy of a household or a farm. In her mind, she was not this lump of a woman on an auction block. She was an architect of systems. But they could not see her mind. They saw only the broad shoulders, the wide hips, the plain, serious face. They saw a beast of burden. "Come on now," Gable cajoled the crowd. "A good, strong woman to warm your bed and work your land. And you be doing a Christian duty, taking old man Hemlock's debts off his shoulders." The mention of Christian duty from this man was so vile it almost made her laugh. The sound that came out was more like a choke. Her father flinched. It was then that she finally looked at him. She turned her head, slowly, deliberately, and fixed her gaze on the man who had given her life and now was selling it to the lowest bidder. Or, in this case, the only bidder willing to take on his financial ruin. His eyes darted away, skittering like cockroaches in the light. He looked at the ground, at the sky, at his own worn boots. Anywhere but at her. That was the final cut, the deepest one. His shame was not for what he was doing to her, but for being seen doing it. A voice, quiet and low, cut through the noise. It was not loud, but it had a quality that made the air still. "The debt," the voice said. "What is it?" Alara turned her head. The crowd parted slightly, like water around a stone. A man stood there. He was not tall, but he was solid, built of the same tough material as the land itself. His hat was sweat-stained, his clothes were worn but clean, and his face was a map of sun and wind. He looked at her father, not at her. Her father mumbled a figure. The man nodded slowly. He looked at Gable. "I'll take the debt." Gable's eyes lit up. "Excellent. A fine choice, Mr. West," the man said. "Silas West." "Mr. West it is." Gable clapped his hands together. A rancher from the high country, folks. Got himself a fine woman. Silas West's gaze finally moved. It settled on her. It was not the leering look of the merchant, nor the dismissive glance of the townsman. It was assessing. The way a man looks at a piece of machinery that is not working right, trying to understand its purpose and its fault. He looked at her face, her hands, her posture. He did not smile. He did not frown. Then he looked back at Gable. "She is not part of the deal," Silas West said. The words were flat. They were final. A confused silence fell over the square. Gable sputtered. "What?" "But the contract, she is the contract." "I will pay the debt," West said, his voice unchanging. "I will not buy the woman." A flicker of something she could not name sparked in Alara's chest. It was so foreign, so unexpected, it felt like a pain. "Now, see here," Gable blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. "That's not how this works. The arrangement is clear. He takes the woman. He takes the debt. That is your arrangement," West said. "It is not mine." He reached into a worn leather pouch at his belt and began to count out coins and notes onto a nearby barrelhead. The sound of the metal was crisp and final in the sudden quiet. He was saving her, but he was also rejecting her. In the same breath, he had declared her not for sale and also not wanted. The flicker of hope died, smothered by a lifetime of understanding her own value. Of course, he would pay to not have to take her. That was the ultimate insult. She was worth a negative sum. The rage that had been coiling inside her finally snapped. She stepped forward to the very edge of the platform. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the force of a tectonic plate shifting. "I am not a sack of flour," she said, looking directly at Gable. Gable blinked, taken aback. "I'm not a horse to be traded, and I am not a debt to be settled." She turned her gaze to her father, who finally looked at her, his face a mess of shock and fear. "You do not own me. You have no right to sell me." A gasp went through the crowd. A woman, and this woman of all women, speaking with such fire. She took a deep breath, the hot air searing her lungs. "And you," she said, her voice dropping, locking onto Silas West. "I do not need your charity. I do not need to be not bought by you. I will make my own way." She stepped off the platform. Her ankle turned on the uneven ground, but she did not stumble. She righted herself, her jaw set. She did not look back. She walked, straight and tall, through the silent, staring crowd. They parted for her now, not like water around a stone, but like grass before a fire. She walked until the sounds of the square faded, until the whispers and the shocked silence were behind her. She turned down a narrow alley between the blacksmith and the feed store, a place that smelled of coal smoke and old manure. There, in the shadows, she leaned against the rough brick wall, and she slid to the ground. The fortress of her mind crumbled. The architect was homeless. The coiled spring unspooled in a gut-wrenching tremor. She wrapped her arms around her knees, pressed her face into the rough fabric of her dress, and the tears came. They were not quiet tears. They were the tearing, ragged sobs of a lifetime of being weighed, measured, and found wanting. She wept for the girl who learned to hide her intelligence so as not to threaten the boys. She wept for the young woman who learned to eat alone to avoid the stares. She wept for the daughter who had just been appraised and discarded like spoiled goods. The sound was raw and animal, the sound of a deep, profound wound being ripped open to the air. When the sobs finally subsided, leaving her hollowed out and aching, a single, cold thought crystallized in the quiet. Never again. She would never again place her life, her future, her worth in the hands of another, especially not a man. Father, broker, buyer, they were all the same. They saw her as a thing, an object, a problem, or a solution. She would rely on herself, only herself. She would build her own walls, lay her own foundation, and be the sole occupant of her own life. It would be a lonely life. She knew that, but it would be hers. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the salt and dirt smearing on her skin. She took a shuddering breath and pushed herself to her feet. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. It was him, Silas West. He stood at the mouth of the alley, his frame blocking the harsh sunlight. He held his hat in his hands. "I did not mean to cause you further distress," he said. His voice was the same, low, even. "Go away," she said, her own voice rough from crying. He did not move. "Gable took the money. Your father's debt is cleared. I told you, I don't want your charity." "It was not charity," he said. "It was a transaction. I bought a man's freedom from fool's bargain." That is all. He paused. "What happens to you now is not part of that transaction." She stared at him, suspicion warring with exhaustion. What did he want? To gloat? To offer her a pittance for her troubles? "Your father has left town," he said simply. "He took the morning coach east." The words landed like stones. Of course he had. He had shed his debt and his daughter in one clean motion. She was truly, utterly alone. A strange, bitter freedom settled over her. "I have a ranch," West said, breaking the silence. "In the high country. It is a long ride from here." She said nothing. She waited for the offer. A job as a cook. A housekeeper. The position the merchant in the crowd had been looking to fill. "I need help," he said, "but I will not have a servant who is not free. And I will not have a wife bought at market." He took a step closer. He was not threatening. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. "I am offering you a position. But first, I'm offering you a choice." She narrowed her eyes. "What choice?" "You can stay here, or you can come with me. If you come, you will have your own room, with a lock on the door, for which you will have the only key. You will be paid a fair wage for any work you do, and you are free to leave at any time. No contract, no debt." It was impossible. It was a lie. Men did not operate this way. Not in her world. "Why?" she asked, the single word sharp as a shard of glass. He considered the question for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Because what Gable and your father did was wrong, and I do not abide by wrong business." He looked at her directly, his eyes holding hers. "I judge people by what they do, not by what is said about them." She wanted to believe him. The desperation to believe him was a physical ache in her chest. But her fresh vow was a shield. Never trust. Never rely. "I don't know you," she said, her voice hard. "No," he agreed. "You do not." He said nothing more. He simply waited, letting the choice hang in the air between them. He was not persuading her. He was presenting facts. The sun was hot. The alley stank. She had no money, no family, and a reputation now cemented in this town as the woman who was sold and then refused. Her options were grim. Starvation was a real possibility. A different kind of servitude, one far worse than what Gable had brokered, was another. This man, this Silas West, was offering an escape. A conditional, suspicious escape, but an escape nonetheless. A room with a lock. Wages. The freedom to leave. These were terms she understood. They were terms of employment, not ownership. She looked at his hands. They were calloused and scarred. The hands of a man who worked. She looked at his face. The lines around his eyes were from squinting into the sun, not from scheming. "If I come," she said slowly, testing the words, "I do not like it, I can leave." "At any time," he confirmed. "I will pay you for the days you have worked, and you can make your own way from there." It was still too good to be true, but it was also the only path that did not lead directly to a cliff's edge. "All right," she said, the word barely a whisper. He nodded once, a short, sharp gesture. He put his hat back on his head. "My wagon is at the livery." He turned and walked away, not waiting to see if she would follow. He trusted her to keep her word, or perhaps he did not care if she did. She took one last look at the alley, at the small, shadowed space where she had shattered and then sworn her vow. She had sworn to be self-reliant. Perhaps this was the first step, not accepting help, but accepting a tool, an opportunity, a wage. She followed him. The wagon was old, the wood weathered to a soft gray. Two sturdy horses stood patiently in their harnesses. He helped her up onto the seat, his hand briefly on her elbow, a touch that was purely functional, without presumption. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the town of her humiliation behind. They rode in silence for a long time. The sun beat down. The wheels creaked. The world opened up into rolling hills and then steepening inclines. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing rumble in the quiet. She had not eaten since the night before. Shame washed over her again, her body always betraying her. Silas West did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the road. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She could not speak. She just nodded, her face burning. He pulled the wagon to a stop under the shade of a large oak tree. He got down and retrieved a canvas sack from the back. He brought out a loaf of dark bread, a block of cheese, and a water skin. He handed them to her. "Eat," he said. Then he walked away. He went to check the horse's hose, his back to her, giving her the gift of privacy. She watched him for a moment, this strange, quiet man. Then she looked at the food in her hands. She broke off a piece of bread, her fingers trembling slightly. She ate. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was food given without condition, without judgment. It was just food for a hungry person. She ate until the sharpest pangs of hunger subsided. She drank deeply from the water skin. When he came back and climbed onto the wagon seat, he did not look at the food or at her. He just took the reins and clicked his tongue to the horses. The wagon started moving again. A crack, a tiny hairline fracture, had appeared in the wall she had built around her heart. Chug. The journey to the high country took 2 full days. They spoke little. He pointed out landmarks with a single word. Red Creek, Widow's Peak. She watched the landscape change, the dusty plains giving way to pine and rock. The air grew thinner, cleaner. It smelled of sun-baked needles and damp earth. His ranch was nestled in a valley, a bowl of green surrounded by jagged, stony peaks. The house was a simple log structure, solid but unadorned. A large barn stood nearby, its roof sagging in one corner. Fences were down in several places, the wood gray and splintered. The place felt tired. It was a good piece of land, she could see that. The water was clear, the grass was good, but it was a place struggling to hold on, like its owner. As they pulled up, an older man came out of the barn. He was wiry and tough as old leather, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He wiped his hands on a rag and watched them approach, his eyes narrowed. "Jed," Silas said by way of greeting. "Silas," the man grunted. His gaze flicked to Alara, took in her plain dress and sturdy frame, and then dismissed her. He looked back at Silas. "Pump's gone again." "I'll look at it," Silas said, climbing down from the wagon. He turned to Alara. "This is Jedediah, my foreman." He looked at the old man. "This is Alara. She'll be helping out." Jed grunted again. It was not a welcoming sound. He clearly did not approve. Another man who saw her as a liability, a burden his boss had inexplicably taken on. She felt the familiar sting. "The house is there," Silas said to her, gesturing with his head. "The room at the back of the hall is yours. Key is on the inside of the door." He then turned and walked with Jed toward a squat building that housed the water pump, their voices low and concerned. They did not look back. She was alone again. She slid down from the wagon seat, her legs stiff. She took her small, pathetic bundle of belongings and walked toward the house. The porch steps creaked under her weight. The front door was unlocked. The inside was what she expected. It was a man's house, functional, cluttered, and coated in a fine layer of dust. Dishes were piled by a wash basin. Boots were scattered by the door. It smelled of old coffee, wood smoke, and neglect. She found the room at the back. It was small, containing only a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small table, and a single chair. But the window looked out onto the mountains, and, as he had promised, there was a heavy iron key in the lock on the inside of the door. She turned it. The click of the bolt sliding home was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of safety, the sound of a promise kept. For a long moment, she just stood there, her hand on the key. This small space was hers. It was not given in exchange for her body or her name. It was a condition of employment. Her vow of self-reliance had not been broken. It had been clarified. She would work. She would earn her keep. She would maintain this boundary. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a quiet fury of activity. It was the only way she knew to combat anxiety, to impose order on a chaotic world. She did not start with the main room. She started with her own. She scrubbed the floor until the wood gleamed. She washed the single window until the mountain view was sharp and clear. She beat the dust from the thin mattress and turned it. Then she moved to the kitchen. It was a disaster, but it was a logical disaster, a problem to be solved. She heated water on the wood stove. She washed every dish, every pot, every pan. She scoured the countertops. She sorted through the pantry, taking mental inventory. They were low on flour, salt, and beans. The coffee was nearly gone, but there was a good supply of dried meat and potatoes. She worked without stopping, her movements efficient and methodical. She was not cleaning to please anyone. She was cleaning because chaos was an enemy. Disorganization was a weakness. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, the main room of the house was transformed. The dust was gone. The clutter was organized. A fire was crackling in the hearth, taking the chill out of the evening air. A simple stew of meat and potatoes simmered on the stove, filling the house with a savory, welcoming smell. She heard their boots on the porch. Silas and Jed. They stopped talking as they opened the door. They stood there, frozen, staring at the clean room, the warm fire, the simmering pot. They looked like two men who had stumbled into the wrong house. Alara stood by the stove, her hands wrapped in her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was bracing for the criticism, for the accusation that she had overstepped. Silas took off his hat. He looked around the room, his gaze taking in every detail. He looked at the clean floor, the neat pile of wood by the hearth, the gleaming countertops. His eyes finally landed on her. He said nothing. Jed was less reserved. He sniffed the air, his wrinkled face a mask of disbelief. He walked over to the stove, lifted the lid on the pot, and peered inside. He grunted. It was a different kind of grunt this time, less dismissive, more surprised. "Supper's ready," she said, her voice quiet. She felt she had to say something. Silas nodded. He went to the basin, which was now clean and filled with fresh water, and washed his hands and face. Jed followed suit. They sat down at the table she had wiped clean. She ladled the stew into 2 bowls and set them down. She did not make a bowl for herself. She would eat later, in her room. She turned to retreat to the kitchen space. "Sit," Silas said. It was not a command. It was a statement. He had pulled out the 3rd chair at the small table. She hesitated. "There is enough," he said. She looked at the chair, then at him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were steady. He was not ordering her to join them. He was making a space for her. Slowly, she got a bowl and filled it with stew. She sat down. The 3 of them ate in silence. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons against bowls and the crackling of the fire. The silence was not awkward. It was full. It was the quiet of tired men at the end of a long day. When they were finished, Jed pushed his empty bowl away. He looked at it for a long second. Then he looked at Silas. "Ah," he said. It was a single, eloquent syllable. It held surprise, approval, and a grudging respect. It was the highest praise she could have imagined from a man like him. Silas stood and took their bowls to the wash basin. "Pump is still not drawing right," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Bearing seized, I think. We'll have to pull the whole assembly tomorrow." Jed nodded grimly. "That's a full day's work, if we can even get it loose." Alara listened, her spoon resting in her hand. A seize bearing, a pump not drawing. She had heard her father and his neighbors complain of such things for years. She had watched them struggle with rusted bolts and worn-out machinery, and she had read about it. In the old engineering manuals and farm almanacs she had devoured in secret, the only books their house contained besides the Bible. She knew pumps, not the way a mechanic knew them with his hands, but the way an architect knew them, as a system, a series of logical actions and reactions. They were talking about the symptom, not the cause. She took a breath. Her voice was barely audible. "It's not the bearing." Both men stopped what they were doing and turned to look at her. The silence in the room was suddenly absolute. Jed's face was a study in skepticism. "What did you say?" She felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. Who was she to question them? A woman. A newcomer. The fat girl from the market. She should have kept quiet. But the words were already out, and the problem, in her mind, was so clear. "It's not the bearing," she repeated, a little stronger this time. She looked at Silas. "You said it's not drawing right. Is the pressure weak? Does it surge?" Silas's eyes narrowed, not with skepticism, but with interest. "It surges, pulls for a second, then nothing. Then it catches again." "Is there a hissing sound near the intake valve?" she asked. Jed and Silas exchanged a look. "Aye," Jed admitted, his voice grudging. "A faint one." "Then you have a vacuum leak," she said simply. "The main seal on the intake pipe has probably dried out and cracked. It's pulling in air along with the water. That's why it surges. The pump loses its prime." She laid out the logic of it, step by step, the way one would lay out a mathematical proof. The words came easily, stripped of all emotion. They were facts. "You're wasting your time pulling the whole assembly," she finished. "The problem is at the wellhead. You just need to replace the leather seal on the main intake flange. You'll need tallow and beeswax to seat it properly." The room was silent for a full minute. Jed stared at her as if she had just grown a second head. He looked from her to Silas and back again, his mouth slightly agape. Silas did not look surprised. He looked confirmed, as if he had suspected something and was now seeing the proof. That assessing gaze was on her again, but it had changed. It was no longer just looking at a broken machine. It was looking at the person who understood how machines worked. "What did you learn about pumps?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I read," she said, shrugging, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. It felt safer than admitting she had spent years observing, listening, and thinking, because no one had ever asked for her opinion. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at Jed. "We'll check the intake seal in the morning." Jed just shook his head, a look of utter bafflement on his face. He stood up, scraped his chair back, and walked to the door. He paused there, his hand on the latch. He looked back at Alara. "Huh," he said again. Then he left. Silas turned back to her. The firelight flickered across his weathered face, making the lines around his eyes seem deeper. The house was quiet around them. "Supper was good," he said. The simple words landed in her chest with the force of a physical blow. It was more than praise for the food. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. He then looked at her, his expression serious, the assessing quality in his eyes more intense than ever. "What else can you do?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them. It was not a challenge. It was an invitation. An honest question from a man who had just discovered he had hired a tool for one job, only to find it was capable of a dozen others he hadn't even imagined. For the first time in her life, Alara felt like someone was seeing past the prison of her body and looking directly into the fortress of her mind. And he was not intimidated. He was curious. She did not have an answer for him. Not yet. She just looked back at him, a universe of unspoken possibilities opening up in the space between them. Vuge. The next morning, she was up before dawn. She had the coffee brewed and a breakfast of fried potatoes and salt pork ready when Silas came into the kitchen. Jed followed a few minutes later, looking sheepish. They ate in their usual silence. As they were finishing, Silas pushed his plate back. "Jed and I are going to check that intake seal." Alara nodded, not looking up from her plate. "You were sure about it," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "It's the most logical explanation," she replied, keeping her voice even. He and Jed left. She listened to their footsteps fade. She was terrified. What if she was wrong? What if she had misdiagnosed the problem from a few scraps of information? They would think her a fool, a pretentious woman putting on airs. The grudging respect she had glimpsed would evaporate, replaced by ridicule. She cleaned the kitchen with frantic energy, her anxiety a physical weight. Every minute that passed was a minute they were proving her wrong. An hour later, she heard a shout from the direction of the well. It was not a shout of anger or frustration. It was a shout of triumph. A few minutes after that, the rhythmic, steady squeak thump of a healthy water pump began. Squeak thump, a steady, reassuring heartbeat. She leaned against the counter, her legs suddenly weak with relief. The sound was proof. She had been right. When the men returned, their hands greasy and their faces streaked with dirt, They did not say a word about it. Not directly. Jed just gave her a quick, sharp nod as he passed her on his way to the wash basin. But Silas stopped. He stood in the kitchen, looking at her. The seal was rotten, he said. Cracked clean through. I'm glad it was a simple fix, she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she had felt. It saved us a day's work, he said. Maybe more, he paused. The ledgers are in the desk in the corner. They don't make sense to me. The numbers are all there, but the story they tell is a bad one. We're losing money, and I don't know why. He was not asking her to look at them. He was telling her where they were. He was leaving the door open. I can look at them, she said. If you want. If you have time, he said, and then he went outside. She had time. She had nothing but time. The desk was old and scarred. The ledgers were thick and bound in cracked leather. She opened the first one. The handwriting was Silas's. It was rough, but clear. Lists of expenses. Cattle sold. Supplies bought. Wages paid. For the rest of the day, she worked. The world outside the windows faded away. The ranch, the mountains, the men, they all disappeared. There were only the numbers. And the numbers told a story. It was a story of slow, creeping disaster. The price he received for his cattle was consistently just below market rate. Not by much. Just enough to be explained away by a bad sale or a tough negotiator. The cost of his feed and supplies was consistently just above the average. Again, not by much. Just enough to seem like bad luck. Fences that needed mending more often than they should. Tools that broke at the worst possible times. Individually, each incident was just a piece of the hardship of ranching. But together, laid out over 2 years of meticulous records, they formed a pattern. It was not a pattern of bad luck. It was a pattern of deliberate, calculated sabotage. She worked late into the night, long after the house had grown quiet. She cross-referenced dates, expenses, and names. And one name kept appearing, in the margins, on receipts for overpriced grain, as the agent for cattle sales that brought in too little. Marcus Thorne. The name was familiar. She had heard it in town. A wealthy man from the east who had been buying up land in the valleys. He was known for being charming, generous, a pillar of the community. He had donated the new bell for the town church. He was also, according to these ledgers, systematically bleeding Silas West's ranch dry. There were other things. Notes from a bank in the nearest city. Loan warnings. Silas was leveraged to the hilt. The ranch was the collateral. If he missed a single payment, the bank would foreclose. And she had a sinking feeling she knew who held the note on that loan. She finally closed the last ledger as the moon was high in the sky. The truth of it sat like a stone in her stomach. Silas was not just struggling. He was being hunted. The next morning, she laid it all out for him on the kitchen table. She had used a fresh sheet of paper to draw a chart, connecting the overpriced supplies, the undervalued sales, the broken equipment, and the name. Marcus Thorne. Silas listened without interrupting. His face, already weathered and grim, seemed to harden into granite as she spoke. He stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the chart she had made. The veins on his forearms stood out. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Thorne, he said, the name a curse. He's been a friend. Offered advice. Offered to help me find better buyers. He found you buyers who worked for him, she said quietly. He arranged for suppliers who overcharged you. He's been strangling you slowly, waiting for you to fail so he can pick up the land for pennies on the dollar. The muscle in his jaw clenched. I trusted him. He counted on that, she said. His anger was a palpable thing in the small room. It was hot and violent. He looked like a man ready to burn the world down. He pushed himself away from the table. I'm going to see him, he said, his voice a low growl. No, she said, her voice sharp. He stopped and looked at her, surprised by her tone. You can't, she said, standing to face him. What would you do? Confront him? He'll deny everything. He's a rich, respected man. You are a struggling rancher. Who will they believe? It will be your word against his. You have no proof. These ledgers are proof, he said, slamming his hand down on the table. They are proof of a pattern, she corrected him gently. They are not proof of his intent. You need more. You need undeniable evidence that connects him directly to the fraud. He stared at her, the rage in his eyes warring with the cold logic of her words. She could see the struggle. His instinct was to meet this threat head-on with force. It was the way of this world. A man's honor was defended with his fists or his gun. But she was offering a different way, a quieter, sharper weapon. He thinks you are a simple rancher, she said. He thinks you are beaten. Let him think that. Let him get comfortable. Let him get careless. We watch. We gather the proof. And when we have it, we do not confront him in a dusty street. We destroy him in a courtroom. A week later, a gleaming black carriage pulled up in front of the house. A man in a fine wool suit stepped out. He was handsome, with a warm smile and polished boots that seemed absurdly out of place in the dusty yard. It was Marcus Thorne. Silas had gone rigid beside her on the porch. "Stay in the house," he murmured. "No," she said just as quietly. "He needs to see me. He needs to assess the new variable." Thorne strode toward them, his smile wide. "Silas, my friend, I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how you were faring." His eyes flicked to Alara, a brief, dismissive glance that took in her plainness and her size. Then he looked back at Silas. "This is Alara," Silas said, his voice tight. "She's helping me with the books." Thorne's smile widened, but did not reach his eyes. "The books? A noble effort. But I fear it a losing battle, my friend. This land is unforgiving." He then turned his full, charming attention to Alara. "And who is this lovely addition to the homestead?" The word lovely was a deliberate cruelty. It was meant to mock her. Before she could respond, he continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Wait, I know you. You're the poor woman from the market square. Hemlock's daughter, the one they were trading." He said it with a concerned frown, as if he were recounting a tragedy. But his eyes glinted with malice. He was establishing his power. He was reminding Silas that his new bookkeeper was a disgraced woman, a piece of damaged goods. He was undermining her credibility before she had spoken a word. Alara met his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not blush. She held his oily, handsome stare and let the silence stretch. She let him see that his dart had hit, but it had not penetrated. "Yes," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I'm the woman from the market. The one Mr. West was good enough to offer honest work to, instead of buying her like a mule." Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected shame, tears, or angry denial. He had not expected calm, factual agreement. "Well," he said, recovering quickly, "a very Christian act on Silas's part. Very charitable." He turned back to Silas, clapping him on the shoulder. "But charity won't save this ranch, my friend. I've told you my offer to buy you out still stands. It will be a clean break, a chance to start fresh somewhere else." "The ranch is not for sale," Silas said, his voice like stone. Thorne's eyes hardened. "Don't be a fool, Silas. You're drowning. Let me throw you a lifeline." He glanced at Alara again, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "Don't let bad advice drag you down the rest of the way." He then smiled, tipped his hat, and walked back to his carriage. As the carriage pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust, Alara looked at Silas. The rage was back in his eyes, but it was colder now, more focused. "You were right," he said. "He's a snake. And now the snake knows there's a new animal in the garden," she said. "He'll be more careful, or he'll get more aggressive." She watched the dust settle on the road. A strange feeling bloomed in her chest. It was not fear. It was anticipation. For the first time, she was not just enduring a hardship. She was facing an enemy. She was not a victim. She was a combatant. She looked at Silas, standing beside her, a silent, solid presence. "We need a plan," she said. She had said we. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes that he had noticed. He gave a single, sharp nod. The alliance was formed. The war had begun. Ja. The plan was quiet. It was a plan of observation and documentation. Alara's plan. Silas, to his credit, agreed to it, bridling his fury and channeling it into a cold, patient resolve. He had to act beaten. He had to act like a man on the verge of collapse. He needs to believe his plan is working perfectly, she had explained, spreading a map of the valley on the kitchen table. He will get overconfident. He will make a mistake. We need to be ready to catch it. So Silas started playing the part. When he went to town for supplies, he let his shoulders slump. He did not argue when the merchant charged him 10 cents more a pound for flour. He sighed and paid. He let the whispers of the townspeople, the talk of his impending failure, wash over him without reaction. Alara, meanwhile, became a ghost. She worked the ledgers, but she also worked the land. She walked the fence lines, not just looking for breaks, but for signs of how they were broken. A clean cut with a wire cutter, not the splintered break of a panicked cow. She examined the soil near the creek, cataloging the health of the grass. She took notes, meticulous, detailed notes. In a new ledger, one hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Thorn's escalation came, just as she had predicted. It was not careless. It was cruel. The rumors started first. They trickled back to the ranch via Jed, who heard them from a sympathetic blacksmith in town. They were ugly. That the fat woman Silas had taken in was a witch, cursing his land. That she was his whore, and his ruin was God's judgment. The stories were designed to isolate them, to turn the entire valley against them. Alara heard the words from Jed, delivered in his typical blunt, unvarnished fashion. She felt the familiar, hot shame. But this time, it was followed by a cold anger. This was not random cruelty. This was a tactic, a weapon aimed directly at her. Thorn had identified her as the source of Silas's new resolve, and he was trying to cut her out. "Pay it no mind," Silas said, his voice rough when he saw her face. "It's the talk of fools." But she saw the way his hands clenched. The rumors hurt him, too. They stained his name, his honor. Then came the physical attacks. Not just cut fences, but something more sinister. One morning, two of the younger hands, Tom and Billy, found a dozen cattle dead near a watering hole. They had not been sick. They lay in the grass, their bodies bloated. Poison. Silas stood over the dead animals, his face a mask of stone. It was a devastating financial blow. But it was more than that. It was an act of profound waste, of contempt for the life he worked so hard to nurture. Alara knelt by the watering hole. She did not look at the dead cattle. She looked at the ground. She saw the faint tracks of a single horse, coming from the direction of the eastern ridge, the direction of Thorn's vast, sprawling property. She saw a small, discolored patch of earth near the water's edge, where something had been poured. She took a sample of the soil, wrapping it carefully in a piece of cloth. "We tell the sheriff," Silas said, his voice raw. "The sheriff is in Thorn's pocket," she countered, standing up. "He dines at Thorn's table every Sunday. He will come. He will look. He will write a report that says the cattle died of sudden sickness. And the report will be a lie." She was right, of course. The sheriff came, a portly man with a lazy eye. He looked at the cattle, shook his head, and spoke of bad water and summer fever. He took no samples. He asked no hard questions. He left before lunch. The pressure was immense. The young hands, Tom and Billy, were spooked. They had at first been wary of Alara, reflecting the town's prejudice. But her quiet competence, the way she had fixed the pump, the order she had brought to the house, and the simple, good meal she provided had slowly won them over. They saw her as part of the ranch. Now, they saw the ranch itself as cursed. Maybe Thorn is right," Billy said one evening, his voice low. "Maybe we should just sell." "We don't sell," Silas snapped, his patience worn thin. The morale was collapsing, and Alara knew she was at the center of it. She was the lightning rod for Thorn's attacks. She was the reason for the rumors. She was the new variable that had provoked this war. One afternoon, she rode into town for supplies. It was a necessary risk. Silas needed to stay on the ranch, watching the remaining herd. She kept her head down, her focus on her list. But she could feel the stares. She could hear the whispers that stopped just as she drew near. As she was loading sacks of flour into the wagon, two women from the town, wives of prominent merchants, walked past. They did not lower their voices. "That's her," one said, her voice sharp with judgment. "The homewrecker, dragging that poor Mr. West into the mud with her." "Shameless," the other agreed. A woman of her size and station. He must be bewitched. The words were like stones thrown at her back. Homewrecker. Bewitched. They were calling her a monster, a parasite. And the worst part was a small, terrified voice deep inside her wondered if they were right. Before she had arrived, Silas was just a man with bad luck. Now, he was a man at war. His cattle were being poisoned. His name was being dragged through the dirt. She had brought this down on him. Her presence was the poison. The thought took root. It was a familiar weed, one she had been pulling her whole life. The belief that she was a burden, that her existence caused problems for others. Her father's debt, Silas's ruin. It was all her fault. That night, she did not sleep. She lay on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, the women's voices echoing in her head. Shameless. Homewrecker. She had come here to be self-reliant. Instead, she had become the anchor dragging a good man down. Her vow had been to never be a burden. And now, she was the heaviest burden of all. There was only one thing to do. The only logical, honorable thing. She had to leave. If she was gone, Thorne's primary target would be gone. The rumors would lose their focus. Perhaps he would ease the pressure, believing he had won, that he had driven out the source of Silas's resistance. It would save the ranch. It would save Silas. The decision was a physical agony. This place, this valley, this quiet, orderly life she was building, it was the first place she had ever felt she might belong. The thought of leaving, it was like tearing a part of herself away. But her logic was relentless. The numbers added up. Her presence was a net loss for Silas West. Before dawn, she packed her small bundle. She wrote a short, simple note and left it on the kitchen table. Thank you for your kindness. I can no longer be a danger to you or this ranch. This is for the best. She did not take the wages he had set aside for her. To take them would be to admit she was owed something. She was owed nothing. She was a debt being cleared. She slipped out of the house into the pre-dawn chill. The sky was a pale, bruised purple in the east. She would walk to the main road and wait for a passing wagon. She did not know where she would go. It did not matter. As she reached the edge of the yard, a flicker of orange against the dark bulk of the northern ridge caught her eye. She stopped. It was not a star. It was too low, too bright. It flickered again, growing, blooming like a malevolent flower. Fire. A sudden, panic shout from the bunkhouse confirmed it. Fire. The north barn. It was the hay barn, the one filled with the entire winter's feed for the cattle. She dropped her bundle. Her decision to leave, her self-pity, her careful logic, it all evaporated in the face of this new, immediate disaster. This was Thorne's final move. Poisoning the cattle was slow. Burning their food was a death sentence for the entire herd, for the entire ranch. She ran, not away, but toward the chaos. Silas was already there, shouting orders, his face illuminated by the terrifying orange glow. Jed was trying to organize a bucket brigade from the creek. Tom and Billy were releasing the terrified horses from the nearby corral. The roar of the fire was a living thing. Then a scream, a human scream of terror from inside the inferno. "It's Billy," Tom shrieked, his face white with horror. He went in. He thought one of the colts was still trapped inside. The roof of the barn groaned, a shower of sparks cascading down. The main door was a wall of flame. Silas did not hesitate. He grabbed a horse blanket from a fence rail, soaked it in the water trough, and wrapped it around himself. "Silas, no," Jed yelled. "It's a death trap." "I'm not leaving him in there," Silas yelled back, his voice raw. He ran toward the smaller side door, which was not yet fully engulfed. Alara watched, her heart seizing in her chest. He was going to die. He was going to die trying to save a boy, and the ranch would die with him, and it would all be for nothing. And in that moment, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, her fear. The cold, calculating part of her mind, the part that saw systems and solutions, took over. She looked at the fire, at the bucket brigade at the distance to the creek. It was too far, too slow. They were losing. But there was another source of water, a bigger one. She grabbed Tom by the arm, his whole body trembling. "The irrigation ditch," she yelled over the roar of the flames. "The main gate. Can we divert it? Tom stared at her, his eyes wide with confusion. What? The ditch that waters the north pasture, she shouted, pointing. It runs 50 yards from a barn. If we break the bank, we can flood the ground around it. We can cut the fire off from the other buildings. Jed overheard her. His old, wrinkled face snapped into focus. He understood immediately. She's right. Get the shovels. Now, the spell of panicked helplessness was broken. Jed's command, backing her logic, gave the men a purpose. They ran for the tool shed. Alara ran with them. She seized a heavy spade, the wood rough in her hands. She ran toward the irrigation ditch, the men following her lead. They attacked the earthen bank with desperate energy, digging, tearing at the packed dirt and roots. Just as they broke through, sending a muddy torrent of water gushing toward the barn, Silas emerged from the side door. He was staggering, half carrying the coughing, soot-blackened form of Billy. He collapsed to his knees, clear of the flames, both of them gasping for air. He had saved the boy. He had chosen life over the ranch. Alara stood, ankle-deep in the cold, muddy water, leaning on her shovel, her body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. She looked at Silas, safe. She looked at the fire, now hissing and steaming as the water reached its edges, its path of destruction halted. She had been about to run, to abandon them, to save herself. But when the crisis came, she had not run. She had turned and fought. She had found a solution. She had not thought of herself as a burden. She had thought only of the problem. The fight was not over. The barn was lost, but the ranch was still standing. The men were alive. As the dawn broke, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gray and pink, Silas found her by the smoldering ruins. Her dress was torn and covered in mud. Her face was smudged with soot. Her bundle of belongings lay forgotten in the dirt 100 yards away. He stopped in front of her. He was holding the note she had left. His hand was trembling slightly. "You were leaving?" he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of profound, quiet hurt. She could not meet his eyes. She stared at the blackened timbers of the barn. I thought I was the cause of all this. That if I left, Thorne would stop. You think I care what Thorne does?" he said, his voice low and intense. He took a step closer. "You think I would trade this ranch for you? Or you for this ranch?" She looked up, startled. "These are just buildings," he said, gesturing at the ruin. "This is just land. We lost the hay. We can buy more. We almost lost a boy. We didn't. That is what matters." He looked at her, and for the first time, the careful mask of his stoicism was gone. His face was raw with emotion. Fear, anger, and something else. Something fierce and protective. "You are not a danger to this ranch," he said, his voice shaking with the force of his conviction. "You are the reason it is still standing. You saved the pump. You found the snake in the grass. You just saved every other building we have. You saved us from running around like headless chickens." He held up the note. This is a danger. This thinking is the danger. Your belief that you are worthless is the biggest lie ever told." He crushed the note in his fist. "Jed told me what those women said in town," he went on, his voice a growl. "I went back. I found their husbands. I told them that if I ever heard another word against you, their credit at the bank would be reviewed. Thorne isn't the only one with influence." She stared at him, speechless. He had defended her, publicly. "You are not a burden, Alara," he said, his voice softening. He said her name. He had never said her name before. It sounded different in his mouth. Solid. Real. "You are the best damn thing that has ever happened to this place. To me." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Don't run. Not from them. Not from me. Stay. Stay and fight. With me." The sun was fully up now, its light cutting through the smoke. It illuminated the devastation of the barn, the mud, the exhaustion on everyone's faces. But it also illuminated his face, earnest and open. She had made a vow in an alleyway, a vow of self-reliance born of betrayal. Here, in the ruins of a fire, he was offering her a new one, a vow of alliance, born of mutual respect. She looked at the smoldering barn, at the determined set of his jaw, at the loyal, tired faces of Jed and Tom. This was not just his fight anymore. They had tried to burn her out. They had tried to shame her away. She would not run. She would not hide. She would stay, and she would bring them all to ruin. "All right, Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady in the morning air. "We fight. F." The fire was the final act of sabotage, but it was also Thorne's greatest miscalculation. He had intended to break them. Instead, he had forged them into something stronger. The loss of the hay was catastrophic. Winter was coming, and without feed, the herd would starve. Selling them off at a loss was exactly what Thorne wanted. It was checkmate. The morning after the fire, Silas, Jed, and the two young hands sat at the kitchen table, their faces grim. The mood was one of defeat. "It's over," Jed said, his voice hollow. "There's no way to buy enough feed now. Not with our credit. We'll have to sell the herd." Silas stared into his coffee cup, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, Ilera saw true despair in him. He had chosen the life of his young ranch hand over his livelihood, and now the cost was coming due. It was a noble choice, a choice that cemented her loyalty to him forever, but it was a choice with devastating consequences. Section Ilera stood by the stove, listening. She had been up all night, not sleeping but thinking. The architect in her mind had been drawing new blueprints. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the gloom. All four men looked at her. "We are not selling the herd," she said. She walked to the table and unrolled the map of the valley, the same one she had used to explain Thorne's strategy. She weighted its corners with salt shakers. "We have lost the stored feed," she said, her finger tracing the boundaries of Silas's ranch. "But we have not lost the feed that is still in the ground." Jed snorted. "What feed? The pastures are grazed down. Another month and they'll be bare." "Our pastures, yes," she agreed. "But look," her finger moved north, past their fence line, into the high country, to the steep, rocky terrain that everyone considered unusable. "Up here, the high meadows, the government land. That's wilderness," Silas said. "It's too steep to graze. No water." "There is water," she said, tapping a series of faint blue lines on the map that she had drawn in herself. "Not creeks. Seeps. Springs. I saw them when I was walking the upper fences. The grass there is long. It's summer-cured. It's standing hay. No one uses it because it's too difficult to get to." "You're talking about driving the herd 5 miles into the mountains," Jed said, incredulous. "It's too risky. A storm could trap them. They could fall." "It is a risk," she conceded. "But selling them is a certainty. This is a chance. A slim one, but it is a chance." She looked at Silas. "Thorne thinks he's won. He's waiting for us to sell. He won't be watching the high country. We can move the herd quietly at dawn. We could graze them up there for a month, maybe 2. It will buy us time." Time to do what? She did not yet know. But time was the one commodity they were completely out of. Silas stared at the map, at the faint blue line she had drawn from memory. He looked at her, at the certainty in her eyes. He had trusted her diagnosis of a pump. He had trusted her analysis of the ledgers. Now she was asking him to trust her with the very survival of his herd. "All right," he said slowly. "We'll try it." The next few weeks were the hardest the ranch had ever known. They moved the cattle at first light, a long, slow procession up the rocky game trails into the high meadows. It was grueling, dangerous work, but Ilera had been right. The grass was there, and so was the water in small, hidden springs she led them to one by one. While Silas and the men managed the herd, Ilera worked on her own front. The final battle would not be won in the mountains. It would be won in a courtroom or a place like it. Thorne, believing he had delivered the final blow, had made his next move. He had called in the loan. A notice of foreclosure had been served. A public hearing was scheduled at the town hall in 2 weeks. The purpose was to finalize the seizure of Silas West's property and assets, to be sold at auction to satisfy his debt to the bank, a bank that Thorne secretly controlled. This was his endgame, the public, legal triumph. Ilera now had her forum, and she had her deadline. She worked with a feverish intensity. She rode to the next county, to the land registry office, spending 2 days poring over deeds and titles. She copied maps, tracing the ownership of every parcel of land Thorne had acquired. A pattern emerged. He always bought land adjacent to water sources. She took the soil sample she had collected from the poisoned watering hole to an assayer in a different town, a man who had no loyalty to Thorne. She paid him from her own small, saved wages. The result came back a week later. Arsenic. She collected the cut pieces of fence wire. She documented the dates, the times, the locations. She wrote it all down in her secret ledger, her handwriting neat and precise. Her case was a mosaic of small, damning facts. The day of the hearing arrived. It was a cold, clear autumn day. The town hall was packed. The whole town had turned out to see the final, public fall of Silas West. It was entertainment. The same faces that had watched her on the auction block were there, hungry for more drama. Marcus Thorne sat at a table at the front of the room with his lawyer, looking confident and magnanimous. He was dressed in his finest suit, the picture of civic responsibility. Silas sat at the other table. He wore his clean but worn ranch clothes. He looked tired, beaten. Alara sat beside him. She had her ledger and a roll of maps. The whispers in the room were a low hum. They were all looking at her. The fat woman, the witch, the homewrecker who had brought him to this. The bank's representative, a man appointed by Thorne, laid out the case. It was simple. Silas West had defaulted on his loan. The bank was exercising its legal right to foreclose. The head of the town council, a man named Henderson who was a known friend of Thorne's, prepared to make the ruling. "This seems to be a straightforward matter," he said, his voice full of false regret. "Does Mr. West have anything to say before we proceed?" Silas looked at Alara. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I do," Silas said, his voice quiet but steady. He stood up. "Or rather, she does." He gestured to Alara. A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne smirked, a look of amused contempt on his face. Let the fat girl speak. It would only make Silas look more pathetic. Alara stood. She felt the weight of every eye in the room. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her mind was cold and clear. She was the architect. This room was her system. "Mr. Henderson, members of the council," she began, her voice even. "We do not dispute the debt. We dispute the circumstances that led to it." She walked to a clear space on the wall and unrolled her first map. It was a map of the valley, showing Silas's ranch and Thorne's adjacent properties. "For 2 years, the West Ranch has suffered a series of misfortunes," she said. She began to lay out the pattern, her voice a calm, factual metronome. Cattle sales that consistently brought in 10% less than market value. Supply costs that were consistently 10% higher. Fences cut. Tools broken. Thorne's lawyer stood. "Objection. This is baseless accusation and hearsay. What does any of this have to do with the loan?" "It has everything to do with it," Alara said, turning to face him. "Because every one of these incidents can be traced back to one man, your client, Marcus Thorne." A gasp went through the room. Thorne laughed, a short, sharp bark of ridicule. "This is absurd," he said, standing. "The woman is clearly delusional. She's trying to blame me for her employer's incompetence." Alara ignored him. She unrolled a second map. This one showed the water sources in the valley, the creeks, the rivers, and the faint blue lines of the springs she had marked in the high country. "Mr. Thorne has been buying land in this valley for 5 years," she said, "and his acquisitions show a very specific pattern." She began to point them out. "He buys land that controls access to water. He bought the old Miller farm to control access to Red Creek. He bought the southern pasture from the Jacobson family to control the headwaters of the Bear River. His strategy has never been about cattle. It has been about water." She then pointed to Silas's ranch. "The West Ranch is the last independent property that controls a year-round water source in this entire region, the spring-fed creek that runs through it. Without it, Mr. Thorne's consolidated properties are worth half as much." Thorne's face had lost its smile. He was watching her now, his eyes narrowed. "This is a conspiracy theory," his lawyer blustered. "Is it?" Alara asked. She walked back to the table and picked up her ledger. "Let's talk about the final acts of sabotage." She read the date the cattle were poisoned. On this date, a dozen cattle died. The sheriff called it bad water. I had the soil tested by an independent assayer. She held up the small certificate. It was arsenic. And on that same morning, tracks of a single horse were found leading from the watering hole directly to Mr. Thorne's property line. She then turned the page. And then there was the fire. The hay barn, an act designed to starve the herd into a forced sale right before winter. Thorne stood up, his face flushed with anger. This is an outrage. This woman, this failed farmer's cast-off, stands here and accuses me, a benefactor of this town, of arson and poisoning? It's preposterous. And then he made his fatal mistake. He lost his composure. The mask of the charming gentleman slipped, revealing the ruthless predator beneath. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. You should have stayed on the auction block where you belong, he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. You are nothing but a fat, stupid girl who has filled this fool's head with nonsense. You have no proof. The room went dead silent. The ugliness of his words, the sheer, naked contempt, hung in the air. He had not just insulted her. He had confirmed her every accusation about his character. He had shown the entire town who he really was. Alara met his furious gaze, and she did not flinch. Proof, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. You want proof, Mr. Thorne? She looked at the council. The fire was set to force the sale of the herd. Mr. Thorne assumed that with no feed, the herd would be sold. He has a bill of sale in his pocket right now for the cattle broker in the next county, dated today, to buy the entire West herd for a fraction of its value. Is that not correct, Mr. Thorne? Thorne's face went pale. How could she know that? But here is the thing, Mr. Thorne, Alara continued, her voice rising, filling the silent room. The herd was not sold, because the herd is not on the ranch. The herd is currently grazing in the high meadows, on government land, safe and fed. She let that sink in. You see, your entire plan was based on one assumption, that Silas West was a predictable, beaten man, that I was a stupid girl. You underestimated us. You assumed we would follow the path you laid out for us. You never thought to look up. She turned to the council head. Mr. Thorne's plan to acquire the West Ranch's water rights was meticulous, but it had a flaw. It required Silas West to fail in a specific way at a specific time. The fire was meant to be the final, predictable step, but we did not act as predicted. And in your frustration, Mr. Thorne, you revealed yourself. She looked directly at Thorne, her eyes like chips of ice. Your rage is your confession. Your arrogance is your undoing. Thorne stood there, sputtering, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been so close. And this woman, this nobody, had dismantled his empire of lies with simple, irrefutable logic. The sheriff, who had been standing in the back, suddenly seemed very interested in the proceedings. He began to move slowly toward the front of the room. He was no longer in Thorne's pocket. He was a man who knew which way the wind was blowing. These are serious allegations, Henderson, the council head, stammered, looking nervously from Thorne to the sheriff. They are, Alara said, and they deserve a full investigation, starting with the bill of sale for cattle that were never sold, and the financial records of the bank that show Mr. Thorne as the primary beneficiary of this foreclosure. Thorne looked trapped. He looked at his lawyer, who simply shook his head. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, who were now staring at him with dawning comprehension and contempt. He was no longer their benefactor. He was a predator who had been unmasked. The sheriff reached the front table. He cleared his throat. Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice suddenly official, I think you'd better come with me. We have a few things to discuss. Thorne stared at him, then at Alara. The hatred in his eyes was pure, but it was the impotent hatred of a defeated man. As the sheriff led him away, a single person in the back of the room began to clap. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire town hall was filled with the sound of applause. It was a roar. It was the sound of public vindication. Alara stood there, frozen, as the sound washed over her. It was the exact opposite of the laughter that had greeted her on the auction block. It was the sound of respect, of victory. She felt a hand on the small of her back. It was Silas. He was standing beside her, his face a mixture of awe, pride, and profound relief. He did not say a word. He just stood there, his hand a warm, solid presence, letting her have her moment. She had won, not with fists, not with threats, but with her mind, her quiet, orderly, relentless mind. The fortress had not just defended itself. It had conquered the enemy. The aftermath was swift. Thorne's empire, built on whispers and intimidation, collapsed like a house of cards once exposed to the light. The investigation revealed everything Alara had claimed and more. He was charged with fraud, arson, and a dozen other crimes. The town that had once revered him now reviled him. His name became a curse. The foreclosure was dismissed. The bank, under new management appointed by the state, renegotiated Silas's loan on fair terms. With Thorne's corrupt network dismantled, the price for Silas's cattle returned to market rates. The ranch began to breathe again. The townspeople's attitude toward Alara underwent a complete reversal. The whispers of witch and homewrecker were replaced by murmurs of brilliant and brave. The same women who had scorned her in the street now offered shy, respectful nods when she came to town. She was no longer an outcast. She was a hero. The applause in the town hall had been overwhelming, a wave of sound that had threatened to knock her off her feet. But it was the quiet respect that came later that truly mattered. Jed now spoke to her as an equal, asking her opinion on crop rotation and herd management. The young hands, Tom and Billy, looked at her with undisguised admiration. She had earned her place not with force, but with competence. A few weeks after the hearing, on a crisp autumn evening, Silas found her on the porch. She was watching the sun set behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was cold and clean. The ranch was quiet, the steady rhythm of its life restored. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time, just sharing the silence. It was a comfortable silence now, filled with all the things that no longer needed to be said. Finally, he cleared his throat. He was holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. He looked uncharacteristically nervous. "The ranch is safe now," he said. "Thanks to you. We saved it," she corrected him gently. "You saved it," he insisted. "I would have lost it. I would have charged in and gotten myself killed or thrown in jail." He looked out at the land, his land, which was now their land. "You taught me a different way to be strong." He held out the paper to her. "This is for you." She took it. It was a legal document, a deed. She unfolded it and read. Her breath caught in her throat. He had deeded her half of the ranch. The house, the barn, the pastures, and most importantly, the creek and its water rights. Her name was there, printed in clear, official letters. Alara Hemlock. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Silas, I can't accept this. It is not a gift," he said, his voice firm, his gaze steady and serious. "A gift is something unearned. You have earned this, every square inch of it. You bled for this land as much as I have, maybe more." He took a step closer. "I want to be clear, Alara. This is not a proposal of marriage. This is not me trying to tie you to this place or to me. This is a partnership. In name, in law, you are a free woman. You can sell your half tomorrow and walk away a rich woman, and I would not say a word, because it is yours, to do with as you will." She stared at the deed in her hands, at her name on the paper. It was ownership, not of her, but for her. It was the ultimate acknowledgement of her worth, given freely, without obligation. It was everything she had ever wanted, offered in a way she had never dared to imagine. She thought of her vow, sworn in that filthy alley, the vow of self-reliance. She had thought it meant being alone, but she saw now that she had been wrong. Self-reliance was not about isolation. It was about agency, the power to choose. "I'm not asking you to marry me," he repeated, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I'm asking you to stay, as my partner, as my equal, because this ranch, it isn't whole without you. I'm not whole without you." Her eyes filled with tears. But these were not the tears of shame or grief she had shed in the alley. These were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude, tears of homecoming. She looked up from the deed and met his gaze. His honest, steady, assessing gaze, which no longer saw a problem to be solved, but a person to be treasured. "I have nowhere else to be," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She folded the deed carefully and held it to her chest. "I'm not staying because of this paper, Silas," she said, her voice growing stronger, clearer. "And I'm not staying because I have to." She took a step toward him, closing the small space that remained between them on the porch. "I'm staying because I choose to. I am choosing this land. I am choosing this life. With you." A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it transformed his weathered features, erasing the years of hardship and struggle. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply reached out and took her hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers, a touch that was no longer functional or hesitant, but full of warmth and promise. They stood there together on the porch of their house, holding hands, watching the last light fade from the sky. The air grew cold, but she did not feel it. She felt only the steady, solid warmth of his hand and the quiet, unshakable certainty that she was finally, truly home. The architect had not just built a fortress. She had built a sanctuary. And for the first time, she was not alone inside its walls.